The rhythmic snip of scissors and the hum of hair dryers filled the air as I sat in the corner of the bustling hair salon. The place smelled faintly of lavender shampoo and heated metal, but I barely noticed. My focus was on Beth, my wife, seated in one of the stylist chairs near the large window. Her laugh, bright and flirtatious, cut through the chatter, drawing my eyes to her as she spoke to Eric, the salon's most popular stylist. Eric, the parikmaker. His expertly styled hair and easy confidence made him a natural charmer, someone you couldn't help but notice. But it wasn't just me noticing. Beth had seemed increasingly animated around him during her recent appointments. What had started as casual banter had, over the past few months, shifted into something more. I shifted in my seat, pretending to scroll through my phone while watching their interaction from the corner of my eye. Eric leaned close to whisper something, and Beth tilted her head back in laughter, her hand brushing his arm. It was subtle, the kind of exchange most people wouldn't think twice about. But I wasn't most people. I knew my wife. The first hint of suspicion had come weeks ago. A missed dinner here, an extra salon appointment there. Just getting pampered, she'd say with a wink. I wanted to believe her. We'd been married for a decade, had 3 kids, and shared a life filled with trust, or so I thought. But now, as I watched them from the waiting area, something about their body language gnawed at me. Eric's hand lingered a moment too long as he adjusted a strand of Beth's hair. Her smile seemed too warm, too inviting. The walls of the salon felt like they were closing in. Beth hadn't yet noticed I was there. I had arrived unannounced, claiming to have a surprise errand near the salon. "I'll pick you up after your appointment," I'd said earlier that morning, casually planting the seed. She'd agreed without hesitation, perhaps too distracted to see the calculation behind my smile. Now, seated in the chair, she was completely unaware of the storm brewing in my chest. A part of me wanted to storm over, demand answers, and put an end to whatever game she was playing. But I stayed rooted, watching, my heart pounding with every stolen glance they exchanged. The stylist beside me was chatting with a client about the weather, oblivious to the drama simmering just a few feet away. My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white. Whatever was happening between Beth and Eric, I was going to find out. And I had a feeling this hairdresser's shop held more secrets than anyone was ready to admit. Beth finally caught sight of me through the mirror. For a split second, her smile faltered, her laughter cutting off mid-chime. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. She quickly recovered, waving at me with the same bright energy that had captivated everyone else in the room. "Mark! What are you doing here?" she called, her voice light and easy, but I caught the faint undertone of nervousness. "Thought I'd swing by early," I replied, standing and crossing the room to her station. I glanced at Eric, who offered me a professional yet slightly too polished smile. "Thought we might grab some lunch after you're done here." "That's sweet," she said, her tone carefully measured. "I'm almost finished." Eric gave her hair one last flourish with the brush, stepping back to admire his work. "You're all set, Beth," he said. Looking as radiant as ever. I bit back a sarcastic retort. Instead, I stepped forward and took her coat from the chair, draping it over my arm. "Ready to go?" Beth hesitated for just a moment, just long enough for Eric to interject. "Actually, Beth, don't forget your next appointment," he said smoothly, handing her a card. "Same time next week?" "Of course," she said, her voice a touch too bright as she took the card. "You're a miracle worker, Eric." I could feel my jaw tighten, but I forced a smile as Beth stood. "Let's get going," I said, leading the way toward the door. The fresh air outside was a relief, the salon's cloying sweetness replaced by the crisp bite of fall. Beth fell into step beside me, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You didn't have to wait inside," she said, slipping her arm through mine. "I could have met you outside." "I didn't mind," I replied casually. "It's interesting to see what goes on in there." She gave a short laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a salon, Mark." "Eric seems friendly," I said, testing the waters. Beth's step faltered, barely perceptible, but enough for me to notice. "He's nice," she said after a beat. "Very professional." "Professional, huh?" I stopped walking, turning to face her. "It looked like you two were having quite a good time." Her smile tightened. "Mark, don't be ridiculous. He's my stylist." "That's all." "That's all." I echoed, my voice calm despite the tension building in my chest. "Then why have you been spending so much time at the salon lately?" Her cheeks flushed, and she glanced away. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said, holding her gaze. "I'm asking." For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Mark, you're overthinking this. It's just a haircut. Don't turn it into something it's not." Her response was polished, almost rehearsed. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let it go. But something inside me whispered that this was just the beginning of an unraveling thread. "Maybe you're right," I said, forcing a smile. "Lunch?" Her relief was palpable, her smile returning full force. "Lunch sounds perfect." But as we walked toward the car, her hand in mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that Beth's secrets were far from over. Eric wasn't just a stylist. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out the truth. The lunch was quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet we used to share. Beth picked at her salad, her usual liveliness muted, while I sipped my iced tea and pretended not to notice how her phone was face down on the table. The rhythmic tapping of her fingernails against the glass distracted me, each tap like a warning bell. "You're awfully quiet," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her tone was casual, but her eyes darted to mine, searching. "Just tired," I replied, offering a half-smile. "Long week at work?" Beth nodded, but I saw the faint line of tension in her jaw. "You should take a day off. Recharge." "I might," I said, setting my glass down and leaning forward slightly. "And you? How was the salon today?" Her fork paused midair, and she gave a small shrug. "The usual. Eric's a perfectionist, which is why I keep going back." "Right," I said slowly. "You do seem to go back a lot." Her smile faltered for the second time that day, and she shifted in her seat. "Are you trying to say something, Mark?" I shrugged. "Just making conversation. You seem close with him." Beth exhaled, her tone sharpening. "This again? I told you, Eric's just my stylist." "You're reading into things that aren't there." "Am I?" I asked, my voice steady. It's not every day a stylist whispers in their client's ear or hands out their personal schedule like it's some exclusive invite. Her fork clattered against her plate, and she leaned forward, her voice low and firm. "Mark, stop. You're being paranoid." I studied her, weighing whether to push further, but something in her expression gave me pause. She was defensive, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else, guilt, perhaps. Or fear. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it quickly, her hand hovering for a second before she pressed it back down, screen still hidden. "Just work," she said, too quickly. "Work?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "On a Saturday?" She didn't answer immediately, instead taking a long sip of her water. "It's nothing important." I nodded slowly, letting the moment hang between us. "Beth," I said carefully, "is there something you're not telling me?" Her laugh was forced, brittle. "What are you talking about?" "You've been acting different," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I feel like I don't know what's going on with you lately." Her smile disappeared entirely, and she shook her head. "Mark, I love you, but you're imagining things. I've told you everything. I don't know why you're suddenly questioning me." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to push the doubts aside and pretend this was just a bad day, a misunderstanding. But something in her voice, a hesitation, a crack, told me I was on the right track. There was more to this story, and I wasn't about to let it go. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. When we returned home, Beth excused herself to shower, leaving her phone behind on the kitchen counter. For a moment, I stared at it, debating whether to pick it up. The screen lit up with a notification. A message. From Eric. The phone on the countertop seemed to glow with an almost accusatory light. The screen displayed a message from Eric: "Can't stop thinking about today. Let me know when you're free to talk." My stomach tightened as I stared at the words. It could have been innocent, a casual remark between a stylist and his client, but the context of the past few weeks made it feel anything but. Beth's sudden increase in salon visits, the way she had been acting distant, and now this? It felt like a puzzle where the pieces were finally falling into place, though the picture it formed wasn't one I wanted to see. I hesitated, torn between guilt and the need for answers. Snooping wasn't something I'd ever done before. It felt wrong, invasive, but her behavior had left me no choice. I picked up the phone, surprised to find it unlocked. The messages between Beth and Eric were innocuous at first, filled with the kind of light-hearted chatter one might expect between a client and her stylist. But beneath the surface, there was a shift. The tone grew more personal, more intimate. Eric's compliments lingered just a little too long, and Beth's responses carried a flirtatious undertone that felt deeply out of place. Eric had told her she was glowing and joked about taking credit for it. She had responded with a playful smiley, brushing off his comment in a way that seemed designed to keep him engaged. Then there was today's exchange, the one that stopped me cold. Eric hinted that their connection could extend beyond the salon, and Beth's reply had been a coy, "We'll see." I set the phone down, my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it could still be harmless, but the weight of the last few weeks said otherwise. Beth's frequent absences, her distracted demeanor, her guarded phone, all of it led back to this. To him. The sound of the shower stopping jolted me back to the present. I quickly returned the phone to its place on the counter and moved to the other side of the kitchen, pretending to be busy. My thoughts raced, tangling in a knot of anger and disbelief. She entered the kitchen a moment later, her hair wrapped in a towel, the steam of the shower clinging to her skin. She smiled, bright and radiant as always, and asked if everything was fine. Her casual tone grated against my nerves, but I kept my expression neutral. Her phone was still on the counter, and I watched her glance at it, just for a fraction of a second, before she picked it up and slipped it into her pocket. She busied herself at the fridge, humming softly, as though nothing was amiss. But everything felt amiss. I tried to focus on her movements, on the routine of the moment, but my mind was elsewhere. My trust, once so solid, had cracked, and I couldn't ignore the splinters. Her explanation about Eric had always been the same, just a stylist, just a professional. But nothing about the messages I had seen fit that narrative. The way she laughed with him, the way she glowed after her appointments, it was more than just a haircut. It had to be. As I stood there, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me, a single question gnawed at me: how far had this gone? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but something held me back. I wasn't ready for her denials, for the inevitable conflict that would follow. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching her as though seeing her for the first time. Her behavior in recent weeks suddenly took on a sharper focus. The subtle changes, the unexplained absences, the overly defensive reactions to innocent questions, all of it pointed to something deeper than she was willing to admit. She left the kitchen after a while, retreating to the bedroom. I stayed behind, staring at the empty countertop where her phone had been. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were loud, replaying every moment, every interaction, every hint I'd missed. Her words from earlier that day surfaced in my mind: "It's just nice to feel noticed." It sounded harmless, but the sting of it lingered. I had always tried to show her how much she meant to me, but apparently, that hadn't been enough. She had sought validation elsewhere, in someone else's words, someone else's attention. I wanted to believe her when she said it was harmless. I wanted to think this was all just a misunderstanding. But as I sat alone in the kitchen, the evidence against her loomed too large to ignore. There was more to this story, and I was going to uncover every last piece of it. That night, the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Beth remained in the bedroom, claiming she was tired, though her voice carried a faint edge of avoidance. I stayed in the living room, the glow of the muted television casting flickering shadows across the room as I stared blankly at the screen. I couldn't stop replaying the messages in my mind, the ease of their flirtation, the way Eric's words seemed to carry an unspoken promise. Beth's responses hadn't been outright incriminating, but they weren't the words of a woman wholly devoted to her husband either. The thought gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the occasional creak of the house settling, a sound I'd always found comforting but now felt like a taunt. I thought about all the moments I had trusted her implicitly, never questioning her motives or actions. That trust now felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. I tried to think logically, to separate fact from suspicion. Flirty messages didn't necessarily mean an affair, but they weren't innocent either. What kind of boundaries had they crossed? Was it emotional, physical, or both? I had no answers, only the crushing weight of doubt. The next morning, I woke early, though I hadn't slept much at all. Beth was already in the kitchen, moving through her morning routine with a practiced ease that felt almost surreal. She greeted me warmly, her voice carrying none of the tension from the previous day, as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. She moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, pouring coffee and slicing fruit. I noticed the small details, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she avoided meeting my eyes for too long. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or something else entirely. I spent the morning in a haze, pretending to go about my day while my mind churned. At one point, I overheard her on the phone, her voice dropping to a hushed tone. She claimed it was her sister, but the explanation felt off. The way she spoke was too cautious, too deliberate, as though she were carefully weighing each word. The urge to confront her grew stronger with each passing hour, but I held back. I wasn't ready to tip my hand, not yet. If she was hiding something, I needed to know the full extent of it before I acted. By midday, Beth announced she was heading out for errands. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. The moment the door closed behind her, I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was my chance to dig deeper. I started with her laptop, a sleek device she used mostly for work. The password came easily, our anniversary date. The familiarity of the gesture stung, a bitter reminder of the bond one thought we shared. Once inside, I combed through her emails and search history, but nothing jumped out at me. Everything seemed normal. Then I checked her social media accounts. Again, nothing overtly suspicious, but there were small details, a few likes and comments from Eric on her photos, subtle but present. Enough to fuel my suspicions further. Finally, I went back to her phone. She hadn't deleted the messages with Eric, which surprised me. Did she think I wouldn't look? Or was she confident they didn't reveal enough? I read through them again, searching for any missed context, but they were just as damning as before. I hesitated, then opened her call log. Eric's name appeared more often than I'd expected. Short calls, mostly, but frequent enough to raise questions. My stomach churned as I thought about what those calls might have been about, what kind of conversations they'd had when I wasn't around. By the time Beth returned, I felt raw, exposed, as if I'd been the one caught doing something wrong. She breezed in with shopping bags and a bright smile, chatting about her errands as if everything were perfectly normal. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. My anger and hurt were too close to the surface. Instead, I excused myself, claiming I needed to work on something in the garage. Once there, I sat on the edge of my workbench, staring at the concrete floor as the weight of the situation settled on my chest. I had always considered myself a rational man, someone who could handle problems head-on. But this was different. This wasn't just a problem, it was a betrayal, a crack in the foundation of our life together. And I wasn't sure how to fix it, or if it even could be fixed. Beth's laughter echoed faintly from the house, the sound carrying through the open garage door. It was the same laugh that had once filled me with warmth, but now it felt like a mockery, a reminder of what I might have already lost. Something had to be done. I couldn't live in this limbo, questioning every word, every glance, every action. The truth was out there, somewhere, and I was going to find it. Even if it destroyed everything in the process. The following days were a haze of suspicion and half-measures. I found myself watching Beth more closely than ever, scrutinizing every word she said, every place she claimed to go. She seemed unaware of my growing distrust, moving through our daily life with an ease that felt rehearsed. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted between us. The warmth that used to fill the space when we were together had cooled, replaced by a tension that neither of us acknowledged. Her phone was never far from her, always in her pocket or face down on the table. And Eric, his name seemed to hover like a ghost, unspoken yet ever present. One evening, as Beth prepared dinner, I decided to test her. Casual, I asked how her day had gone. She responded with the usual details, errands, a visit to the grocery store, and, of course, her appointment at the salon. Her voice was steady, her words innocuous, but the mention of Eric's name sent a pang through me. She described the appointment as routine, praising Eric's skill and creativity, but I caught the faintest shift in her tone, a slight elevation, as though speaking about him brightened her mood. I nodded along, careful not to reveal the storm building inside me. She had to know I was suspicious. Didn't she? Or was she so confident in her ability to mask the truth? The next morning, I made a decision. I would visit the salon myself. Not as a client, I had no intention of sitting in Eric's chair, but to observe, to see if I could glean anything from watching him in his element. The salon was bright and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural light. The scent of hair products and the hum of blow dryers created an almost soothing atmosphere, but my focus was on Eric. He moved through the room with an air of effortless charm, laughing with clients, offering compliments, and managing to make each person in his chair feel like the center of the world. I watched him carefully, noting the way he interacted with the other stylists and customers. He was professional, yes, but there was an undertone to his behavior, a kind of practiced intimacy that felt almost predatory. It wasn't overt, but it was there, in the lingering touches and the way his eyes locked onto his clients just a moment too long. Beth wasn't there that day, which both relieved and frustrated me. I had hoped to see how they acted around each other, to confirm or disprove my suspicions. Instead, I was left with impressions, fragments of information that only deepened my unease. I lingered just long enough to feel conspicuous before leaving, my mind churning with questions. Was this all in my head? Had I imagined the connection between them, fueled by my own insecurities? Or was there truly something more, something they were both hiding? Back at home, I found Beth in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I entered, her smile warm but guarded. It was a small detail, but it stood out to me now, the way her expression seemed calculated, as though she was constantly evaluating how much to reveal. As the days passed, I noticed other details, little things that would have once seemed insignificant. The way she avoided making plans that conflicted with her salon appointments. The occasional slips in her stories, moments where her explanations didn't quite align. Each piece added to the growing puzzle, a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between suspicion and denial. I needed clarity, one way or another. And so, I began to plan. If Beth wouldn't give me the truth willingly, I would have to find it myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something concrete had to be done. Late one evening, when Beth had gone to bed, I retrieved her phone. My heart pounded as I navigated to her call logs and messages. Eric's name was there again, several missed calls and a new message. Tomorrow at 2. I'll make it worth your while. I returned the phone, careful not to leave any trace of my intrusion. The time matched her upcoming salon appointment. If I wanted answers, I had to witness it myself. The next day, I followed her. Beth left the house, her demeanor calm, as if nothing was amiss. I kept my distance, staying several cars behind as she drove toward the salon. She parked, and I watched as she entered the building. Through the window, I saw her greet Eric. Their interaction looked professional at first glance, but as they moved further into the salon, their closeness became apparent. He leaned in too often, smiled too broadly, while her gestures mirrored his warmth. I couldn't stay long without drawing attention. The glimpse, though brief, felt like confirmation. When she returned home later, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more than fleeting observations. The weight of my decision hung heavily. I was stepping into dangerous territory, one where trust and betrayal collided in ways I couldn't yet predict. The truth was near, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The tension had reached its peak. I couldn't wait any longer. That evening, as Beth sat at the dining table scrolling on her phone, I took the chair across from her. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to stay calm. I know about Eric, I said quietly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. For a moment, she said nothing, her phone slipping from her hands onto the table. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice wavering. I explained everything, the messages, the calls, even following her to the salon. Her expression shifted from shock to anger to something I couldn't quite place. You've been spying on me, she finally said, her tone defensive. You've been lying to me, I countered, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. I want the truth, Beth. What's going on between you and Eric? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then, her shoulders sagged. It was just attention, she said softly. I liked the way he made me feel. Like I was special. But nothing happened, Mark. I swear. I wanted to believe her. Desperately. But trust, once broken, isn't so easily repaired. Do you expect me to take your word for it? I asked. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I've made mistakes, she said, her voice trembling. But I love you. I don't want to lose what we have. The words sounded sincere, but sincerity wouldn't erase the doubt. That night, I lay awake, the weight of her confession pressing on me. She claimed nothing physical had happened, but even the emotional betrayal cut deeply. The decision ahead wasn't an easy one. Could I forgive her? Could we rebuild what had been broken? As the first light of dawn crept through the window, I realized the answer wasn't immediate. Trust takes time to rebuild, and love, even when it remains, doesn't erase the scars of betrayal. For now, I decided to stay. Not for her, but for our family. But deep down, I knew the path ahead would be long and uncertain. And part of me wondered if we could ever truly find our way back. The end.